It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Maryam Abdool-Richards, CM. Dr. Abdool-Richards is an accomplished senior government official and currently holds the office of Acting Principal Medical Officer Institutions with the Ministry of Health of the Government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. She is also a non-executive director of public sector and private sector entities in the financial services, manufacturing, and health sectors. In May 2022, she was elected as the vice chair of the 75th World Health Assembly of the World Health Organization held at the Palais des Nations, Geneva, Switzerland. In September 2022, Dr. Richards was awarded the Shakonia Medal Gold, Trinidad and Tobago's second highest national award for meritorious service in the sphere of leadership in public health and medicine. In this regard, she is one of the youngest recipients of this award and the youngest physician in the history of our country to receive this honor. In August 2021, she was recognized by the US Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, for her leadership of frontline staff in the COVID-19 pandemic. More recently, in January 2023, Dr. Richards was selected as the Caribbean delegate for 2023 to participate in the International Visitor Leadership Program, which is the US Department of State's premier professional exchange program for emerging foreign leaders. This program's alumni include over 330 heads of state and government, including the late Professor George Maxwell Richards and former Prime Ministers Mrs. Kamla Persaud-Bissessar, Mr. Basil Pandey, and the late Mr. Patrick Manning. Dr. Richards has also been recognized by the Energy Chamber of Trinidad and Tobago for her collaboration in ensuring business continuity in the energy sector. A passionate philanthropist, she also serves as a director of the Heroes Foundation, a unique organization that nurtures youth leadership. And she also serves as an executive board member of the Shelter for Victims of Domestic Violence. She also serves as the assistant treasurer of the Arthur Lockjack Global School of Business Alumni Association. Dr. Richards is passionate about using her practical knowledge and certified expertise to build collaborative relationships of purpose between organizations, creating and executing efficient and robust strategies that satisfy corporate objectives, while at the same time fostering a diverse and inclusive environment for all stakeholders. So once again, we welcome all of you, and I hand over to Maryam to take over today's panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Kamla and Siron, for this kind invitation and to really kickstart the first episode of Conversations with the CCGI for 2023. It's really a pleasure to speak to everyone here and to have this conversation because I'm a very proud member of the CCGI and I've really dedicated a lot of time and learned significant knowledge and gained experience from the past year when I joined as a board director. Today's session is a conversation, and I will start by doing a brief presentation accompanied by a PowerPoint presentation regarding the issues surrounding managing disruption. Then we will have a Q&A session, and of course, there is the opportunity and the offer for persons to post their questions via email to the CCGI so that I may respond in conjunction with Kamla. So I look forward to your attention. I look forward to your participation in today's session. I will now share the screen. So this presentation is about managing disruption. And we live in a transformative age. We know this. The COVID-19 pandemic was initially viewed as a global health crisis, but it has created significant economic and social disruption affecting every nation and its citizens. The pandemic taught us many lessons. However, the main one is that in a world of volatilities, shocks, uncertainties, albeit disruptions, the only market certainty is change. The pandemic has in fact accelerated change, and we need to embrace and understand change. The precursor of change, however, is disruption, and today's session is centered around managing disruption. We should not fear disruption. Instead, we should see it as an opportunity to innovate, to evolve and thrive, and a means of enhancing the overall resilience of our organization, which ties into the competitiveness and the sustainability. Managing disruption effectively also builds the resilience of our organization and our people in the organization. In today's installment and the first installment of the CCGI conversations, we will discuss and share perspectives around disruption. We will use local examples and examples that have affected the region to discuss the mechanisms around disruption. And we will also look at the board's role versus the operational role in disruption. All examples that I would have used have the information is in the public domain and is not considered proprietary, and many are from the local context. This is to allow everyone to relate to it. So I look forward to you sharing your experiences and lessons from managing disruption. As I said, we now focus on real-life disruptions pertinent to our local and regional context. So here are our slides regarding what are geopolitical risks, Russia and the Ukraine war. Now, we're all familiar with the overall risk, which is the geopolitical risk between Russia and the Ukraine war. And the level of financial and economic uncertainty caused by the Russia and the Ukraine war really reached an all-time high and has actually exceeded the level recorded in the COVID-19 pandemic. There are immediate implications of this geopolitical situation that include high inflation, low growth, low business confidence, and supply chain disruptions caused by scarcity and the rising prices of commodity materials, energy, transport, and so. And this really ties into supply chain disruptions and also affects several of the other risks that we will be discussing today. When we discuss risks, we look at contagion, we look at natural disasters affecting Trinidad and Tobago that have affected us in the last 5 years or so, floods, earthquakes, and hurricanes. We look at cyber attacks, supply chain disruptions, and industrial relations. Now, the board itself and the role of the board would be to mitigate risk and to approve strategies that have been set by the executive management. And managing uncertainties and managing disruptions must form a core element of that strategy. The board must be aware of the risks affecting the business and also risks that are geopolitical in nature and that may affect that business, and really have management plans in place to allow for scenario planning, policy development, and approval, and really all around mitigating risks. And this is where managing the disruption really comes into place. The board itself really is responsible for enhancing stakeholder and shareholder value. And of course, now we are all familiar with the ESG principles and the ESG indicators that are of particular importance in the private sector and in the private sector of note and now being expanded into other sectors. The actual role of managing disruption and policy development will fall under the Audit and the Governance Committee, but I'll speak about that in further detail as we progress. This discussion, I started and spoke about the geopolitical risks because the geopolitical risks are actually tied in to all of the other risks that are associated. And when we think about disruptions and disruptions that are tied to the geopolitical risks, there are three main types of disruptions. There are wicked problems, chaos theory, and black swans. And wicked problems are problems that are difficult to really manage because there's incomplete information, there are changing requirements, there's contradictory information, and often there's no definitive formula to stop the actual situation or challenge. An example of a wicked problem would be issues like such as poverty, climate change, education, and in some cases, emerging infections. Another distinctive type of disruption or nature of disruption would be around chaos, the chaos theory, which is actually a mathematical theory. And it's really about an unpredictable challenge, a nonlinear challenge. And for example, natural disasters and disaster management fall under this category. Then there are black swans, the black swan theory. And these are disruptions that are difficult to predict in the normal course of business, that are random and unexpected and have a huge impact to societal aspects. COVID-19 falls as a black swan. It's interesting, though, that there is a link between the three issues, especially between wicked problems and black swans, because black swans can lead to wicked problems. As I indicated at the start, I identified risks that really were pertinent to the Caribbean region and the Caribbean region. We are all familiar with contagion as a risk. That really refers to the COVID-19 pandemic, but it can also refer to new emerging infections such as monkeypox and Ebola. Natural disasters are commonplace in our region. We must be on guard for floods, earthquakes, and hurricanes. We have now seen the impact of cyber attacks, the impact of attacks on critical IT infrastructure that can affect from the state down. And we'll discuss some examples about mitigating risks and really surviving in that disruption. Then we know about supply chain disruptions. We've all experienced it. We've all looked at supply chain disruptions due to the Suez Canal interruption and blockage, and of course, due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the issues around port disruptions in China. Locally, we have to consider industrial relations disruptions. How do we manage our business? How do we continue and ensure business continuity when there is some level of industrial relations that is often unpredictable and difficult to resolve at times? Security is another disruption that we must consider. We had incidents last year in July where there were riots on the BTM, resulting in gridlock traffic, resulting in a lot of fear and uncertainty. So these are 6 common disruptions that are pertinent and that I would share practical examples of in the presentation. Now, as a board, there must be essential strategy considerations for managing disruption. And as we discuss the examples on how we manage disruption, I would just like to identify 5 questions that I would like you to keep asking yourself as we do this presentation. How does the organization's strategy manage human capital during a disruption? We need to keep our people and our staff and their families and the communities in which the communities that we operate in safe. They must be comfortable. There must be a level of trust. Does the strategy preemptively identify and redefine key risks as potential opportunities for innovation and expansion? So we have to look at disruptions and identify them at risk. And how could we innovate? How can we enhance our competitiveness? How does this strategy identify and address the use of digital technologies? The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated the use of digital technologies across all our organizations and the reliance on that. Does the ESG strategy identify and consider risks and disruptions? What shock absorbers, what policies, what internal controls have been incorporated into the organization to remain resilient, and how do we assess those? That is through our audit committees or our governance committees. Now, there's a key measure and a fundamental and underlying basis for managing disruption. And it's a theme that you will hear me repeat throughout the presentation, and we are all aware of this. We must be people-centered. Without people, without the appropriate people skills, we will not gain the trust of our employees, their families, and their communities. People are key to the organization's sustainability and managing disruption. Communication, risk communication, crisis communication, communication to the media, to the public, and to all our stakeholders is also imperative and is important. And these 2 factors, managing the human capital and ensuring that there is communication that is concise, that is clear, and that is very truthful and authentic, they are both very, very important factors. So I just like you all, if there was one take-home message today, to remember that communication and a people-centered approach are key to managing disruptions. I'd like to now move to the first type of disruption, and one that we are all familiar with, which is contagion. In this map, I would have identified the starting points for outbreaks or worsening or exacerbations of the pandemic globally. And they would have all impacted us in some way or the other. So we look at Portugal in July, there was a monkeypox outbreak, and there was a lot of uncertainty about what was going on with monkeypox and how challenging monkeypox would be. There was a lot of fear, there were rumors when monkeypox hit in Jamaica, that it was in Trinidad, and there were a lot of questions that were asked about monkeypox. So that was one example. COVID-19 is not the only contagion risk. Of course, there's always the threat of Ebola. There was an outbreak in Uganda last year, and we do significant business, especially with respect to the energy sector and movement of persons. And we have had challenges in Trinidad and Tobago where there was, a suspected case when someone came in, and we had to track the case through the Ministry of Health. In using an example about the risk of contagion and managing disruption, I'd like to speak about the energy sector in Trinidad and Tobago. And one of the proudest moments and achievements for us as a country and the COVID-19 team has been the energy sector's ability to survive and to have constant business continuity throughout the pandemic, despite multiple outbreaks. And, I'd really like to commend the upstream, downstream operators, PLE, and the Energy Chamber, as well as the energy services companies, for really working together and having that sort of leadership in keeping the energy sector running. Now, this is the MERS Discoverer. And this is a production platform, meaning one that would produce, it's a compression platform and one that produces gas, that was really set up by BPTT in 2021. The project that they were working on or the area was called Cassia C, and it was BPTT's first offshore compression platform and really used to access low pressure products. It is located about 35 miles off the southeast coast. And in June 2021, there was an outbreak on the Cassia on the MERS Discoverer, as well as the accompanying flotel where the staff would work. There were 250 men on board, and there are significant implications to the country, not just because of a fall in revenue due to a fall in production, but in terms of reputational risks. The disruption in this platform would have resulted in reputational risk to BPTT and the country in terms of how this challenge was being managed. And it was a very interesting case study from a governance perspective. Now, we may not really be speaking about a board of BPTT, but from a governance perspective and how we work together, I like to discuss it as a case. Now, we would have been notified in the Ministry of Health about this outbreak, and there were existing policies around quarantine. There was legislation around quarantine, and we had to partner with BPTT, with MERS, which is the company or the organization that really would have the platform there, that ran the platform. And we had to consider risks. As I said, at that point in time, there was competition for platforms to be in Guyana, Curacao, and Suriname. And if we did not manage this disruption appropriately, there was a risk that the company would move the platform elsewhere and disrupt the BPTT's production. Key messages in terms of how we manage this disruption. And really, when we look at the strategy questions that I would have spoken about, we managed the human capital by sharing information. We had expert persons share information via video medium, and that was really done through BPTT's corporate communication department, the OSH and HSSC department. So lesson one, clear communication to persons on the rig and their family. Uncertainty and disruption breeds fear, and fear breeds, persons being unable to function, and it increases the risk or the actual disruption around contagion. The second factor that we would have looked at in terms of the strategy was partnerships. There was a clear partnership and discussions and open communication between the Ministry of Health, between BPTT, between the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries, and of course with Maersk. And we worked together to ensure that the communication was clear and to come to a compromise and an agreement that was in the benefit of the country as well as other stakeholders. The other factor that we would have looked at would have been the identification of risks. And I have to commend the upstream operators, and that's a group of CEOs. I was a member of that group, and that is a group of CEOs from Shell, De Novo, Perenco, BPTT, at the time BHP Billiton, who would have worked together in terms of combining their efforts and collaborating. There wasn't competition at that point in time in terms of companies. They all got together and they shared best practices. And one of their best practices was around scenario planning. I recall the country chairman of Shell saying the month before, the question is not how did we get the outbreak, it is what we do when we get the outbreak. And scenario planning was done to ensure or to practice what would happen in terms of an outbreak. So the strategy adopted was tested, and there were risks that were identified, communication risks, reputational risks, risks surrounding logistics. And there was a clear written plan and protocol in place to address those risks. Then that plan was discussed and shared with the Ministry of Health. There was an approval. And when the actual situation hit, we were able to work with their plan as well as our policies and actually accelerate and implement the ideas there. Regarding digital technologies was used in communicating with the men on the platform at that point in time. There was clear communication again, and that was the real role of digital technologies. Now, persons may say, okay, there's an outbreak on the rig, there are 250 men, and on this platform, why don't you just demand and demobilize? But that was not an option, because there are critical functions that must occur on a platform, and we could not just demand the platform and move everyone off. We had to consider moving people off while maintaining critical functions, as well as bringing new people on, and of course, sanitizing the platform. And then we had to house persons. And the collaborative effort in terms of the strategy and communication and digital technologies and really managing the entire situation was really addressed well by BPTT. The ESG strategy, of course, this sort of activity that was run by and managed by the HSSC department did fall under their sustainability charters. I'm not going to go into too much detail in terms of ESG, but there was a strong sustainability component and the interaction of the corporate services alongside OSHA and HSSC. And then we speak about shock absorbers, and shock absorbers really refer to those policies. It refers to the documents around scenario planning. It refers to SOPs that were done. And these were done in conjunction and collaborating information from BPTT's international office, from academia and shared areas, and also from the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries, because our overall aim was to ensure business continuity, but ensure that lives were saved. This is a classic example and an excellent example of collaboration and partnerships and appropriate human capital management through effective communication in mitigating risks and allowing business continuity. And I'll just share with you that in June of 2021, when we had one of the largest surges and just post calling the state of emergency on May 25th, every single upstream operator had outbreaks on their rigs, platforms, and their installation, every single one. So I was managing 9 outbreaks with them at any given point in time for about 2 weeks. And if that disruption was not managed appropriately, there would have definitely been an interruption to the energy, the gas production and to exploration, and really affect our revenue being an energy producing company. The second risk that I like to speak about, and one that we are all very familiar with, would be natural disasters. And we've noticed, especially over the last 5 years, the impact of natural disasters in Trinidad and Tobago. That is, of course, tied to that wicked problem of climate change. And recently, in January, we had severe floods in Trinidad and Tobago. In December, sorry, there were severe floods in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, these images that I'm sharing actually refer to floods that occurred in November of 2018, which was the Greenvale flood. And the reason that I'm sharing these images is because at this point in time, you know, it was basically defined as a national emergency. So these were some of the worst floods that we would have seen affecting communities, especially in East and South Trinidad. The highway was blocked off, etc. And how did we manage this disruption? Now, this was somewhat of the first time in a long while that this sort of disruption occurred. And one of the key factors in managing disruption was scenario planning and communication. And yes, there were a lot of lessons to be learned in how this was managed. As I said, it was a new or a different sort of disruption. And firstly, we had to look at, again, the role of people and partnerships. A lesson learned from managing this disruption was that there needed to be effective partnerships and preemptive partnerships between government, between the Ministry of Works and Transport, between the Ministry of the Office of the Prime Minister, where the ODPM falls under, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of National Security, because we had to bring army and police persons had to come in to evacuate persons. There needed to be security at shelters. So in terms of managing human capital, the strategy here, and again, I speak about our governance, I'm using broad examples because they can affect your organization. So first strategy would be effective partnerships. In terms of the strategy at the board level, there needs to be scenario planning and there needs to be policies around natural disasters. We also need to care about our employees who may be affected by natural disasters. What happens to our operators or administrative staff who are affected by floods and who may have, you know, who are distressed because they've lost everything in their home? We should have a plan in place to assist them and not just look at the actual business operation. We also need to consider and be compassionate and care about the community in which we operate and the surrounding environments, and possibly not just the frontline communities, but in a wider national context. So the board must have a strategy that identifies this and a clear budget. The strategy, of course, and I'll just jump to the internal shock absorbers, would be policies that are set by the, and are brought to be approved by the audit committee of the board, and then referred or recommended by the audit committee, and then referred for approval to the board. Then once those policies are in place, the next shock absorber would be SOPs that are done operationally. An incident command system is essential. We must have a focal point person who is managing, and scenario planning is another shock absorber that needs to be built in. Now, these are operational issues, but it's really the board's responsibility to ensure that these activities are being taken place, and really the audit committee through enterprise risk management can manage this issue. Natural disasters and the management often fall under on the OSH HSSE side, and really ties in now to the ESG metrics that we would be looking at natural disasters as an environmental risk factor. Digital technologies, again, should be utilized in terms of communication generally, and there must be backup measures. There must be a measure if the phone signals go down, if there's a power interruption. Are there satellite phones? Is our policy, does our budget really allow for these things? Because from our strategy plan, there's the budget that we have to approve as a board, and we must ensure that the appropriate budgetary allocations are in place. Now, recently last year, I believe it was July 2022, there was a possible disruption when we had a tropical wave approaching Trinidad and Tobago. And we had to mitigate and we had to anticipate that disruption in one of the organizations that I'm a board member on. And what really worked for us was having this incident command system. We had a focal group. We had a focal point, which was the OSH HSSE manager, and he reported to the CEO. The CEO then reports to the board. There was clear communication that was ongoing. There was heightened security. But the main factor here that really allowed and permitted the continuity of the business was the fact that scenario planning was in place prior, and there was a policy, and there were drills, and there was practice that was going on. We don't know when a natural disaster will occur, but we need to consider it in our enterprise risk management across the organization. And we really need as a board to ensure through the various committees that scenario planning is ongoing. We need to ask the questions about it. And really, if there's a challenge, we step in to provide support. I'd like to now move to cyber attacks, and that's our third risk. And we're all familiar again with the issue that occurred in Massey stores last year in April, when really there was a malware problem and a malware attack. Now, some of the common attacks that can occur and cause disruption would be malware, phishing, and a password attack. And malware is when a software is intentionally designed to disrupt your entire IT system. So there's a software that enters your system, and the most common one would be what we call ransomware. I mean, think about the term ransom, and information that may be confidential or maybe proprietary. I'll give you an example. For proprietary, imagine if the Angostura bitters recipe was leaked or was taken away from the company or not accessible. And then a ransom is now being asked by the hacker to provide the information back, right? Or to return the information. Malware, as I indicated, was the issue around Massey. Then there's phishing attack. We're familiar with phishing. You click on a link and it asks you to put in your credit card information or your banking information. You think you have a good deal, and then it seizes that information. And then password attacks, where you have a hacker that would just be working on accessing passwords. There are all statewide implications for all of these attacks, and also they can affect the organization. And when I speak about statewide attacks, just to give an idea of how critical cyber attacks are beyond our organizations, there was an attack in Ukraine where a couple of years ago, just prior to the conflict in Ukraine, where the entire power grid went out. And there's risk to human life, and there's risk now to continuity in every business. There's also attack in Guyana in the last couple of years on the electrical company, again, risk to human life and economic issues around that. Now, it's key when we are addressing disruptions in cyber attacks that we tie in trust. Cyber attacks cause disruptions when they are tied to the information base and the assets of a company. So for example, a cyber attack affecting a bank where person's financial information is being used, and passwords that they can have, various transactions being done. Think about in the health sector and the insurance sector, when confidential health information can be leaked and made public, or may not be available for assessments. Think about, as I said, the proprietary information. For example, if you have a particular recipe like the Angostura bitters and the impact. Now, how do we manage the actual disruptions as a board? So ransomware really is the most common type of attack that we would have to really look at in terms of a board. And the first area in mitigating risks and managing these disruptions would really be, again, having the internal buffers, and the buffers such as the policies in place, the SOPs in place, and scenario plannings, again, to ensure that there is a policy regarding cyber attacks and what is done. And that SOP, which is a little bit more operational, and I'll just share with you, would involve containing the issue, detecting which systems are affected, detecting which data is affected, and then trying to really isolate and mitigate potential attacks and backups. Now, what does the board do in a disruption? The board must understand where the risks are to the company. Is there confidential employee information? Is there a proprietary recipe or proprietary information around that? The board must understand that the cyber attacks forms a major part of your enterprise risk management. The audit committee needs to examine the enterprise risk management framework to ensure that cyber attacks in there. There must be continuous risk assessments, and those risk assessments really are around what is called threat and vulnerability assessments, and then penetration testing. And these activities must be embedded in the ERM. Now, when there is a disruption, as I indicated, the board needs to be informed. There must be clear communication to the board. There must also be clear communication to employees, to the media, and to other stakeholders, to the shareholders, and to the persons who are affected. And this would now kind of enter the realm of crisis communication, and it should be done by a specialist and a technical expert. This communication should actually be prepared and in advance in terms of the policies that would be on the board. So as far as the management of human capital, communication, and information, having specialist support proactively is important. When the disruption does occur, as Massey did, there was constant communication via the media, and they were updating the public as to where the challenge was. In terms of identifying risks and measures for innovation, enterprise risk management, and the impact of the risk and the board's understanding of cyber attacks, and asking the questions around mitigating those risks at meetings. How does the strategy address digital technologies? Well, we're speaking about a digital technology measure here in detail. And really, in this case, we are looking at digital technologies affecting communication and communication to the relevant persons I would have spoken about, as well as backup systems that we would have in place. Does the ESG strategy identify and consider risks and disruptions in managing? Yes, our ESG strategy, and especially under the governance principles and the environmental principles, must address cyber attacks. And as I indicated earlier, the shock absorbers, scenario testing, SOPs, and policies form the framework and the basis of managing a disruption. The other area that I'd like to touch on in terms of cybersecurity would be managing IT transitions. We know that in the financial services sector, the banks and the insurance companies, that there are IT conversion methods, and we have to ensure that the IT transition process is managed very carefully in the event, because we don't want that system to be disrupted. There's a significant risk, especially in terms of reputational risk. Security. We must not forget the impact of security risks. And last year, again, in July, we had a challenge with some riots in Vietnam. And this really is a wicked problem. Crime just seems to be a problem that we have to address, and they're always changing, changing arrangements. There's a lot of changing circumstances around crime. When we think we're on the way to addressing it, something else happens. When we think that the numbers are going down, there's an upsurge. And there's often a challenge in managing security issues. Security issues really, in terms of managing a disruption, and again, I'll speak to what happened in July of last year with the Vietnam riots, require partnerships. So when we speak about how does this strategy really manage human capital, partnerships comes as a priority, or should be a priority. Partnerships between the organization, within the organization, ensuring that the trade unions are involved, and ensuring that the media is aware, partnerships between government, the Ministry of National Security, the Ministry of Works, because when rubble is burning, somebody needs to come and clear it when it has to be moved. The Ministry of National Security, of course, would be the police, the army, the defense force, the traffic management systems. We all know that there's a risk of looting when there's a security threat and a risk. The other management of human capital would be clear communication. This sort of risk affects everyone. It may affect people more readily and in a greater impact in the immediate basis than, for example, a cyber attack, which will affect one organization. But in this case, you're looking at a fair factor. And when the board is managing or reviewing the policies around security, there must be a proper plan regarding communication to the communities that are around, and contingency planning. Scenario planning, yet again, is another one of those buffer measures to ensure resilience. Digital technologies, we would have spoken about that. There's I know that, like, for example, last year, one of the organizations that I'm a board member on sent drones up, because there were drones that we would have had, and the drones were really used to assess what was going on and to see if there was a threat near to the actual business place. Security, again, falls under the ESG risk factors, and really we need to look at ESG as a tool to identify risks to the sustainability of our business and our organization, but also as a tool to detect potential opportunities. And we can learn from other organizations. We don't have to reinvent the wheel in terms of managing security at a risk. Shock absorbers were spoken of. I spoke about those just a couple of minutes ago, but we all need to look at security as a general risk in Trinidad and Tobago regionally and as well as regionally. Supply chain disruptions. During the COVID-19 pandemic, there were a lot of backlogs in China due to a number of reasons. And this is just an example of a port in China. Now, we know that a lot of our imports locally and regionally come from China. And really, there were major impacts in terms of the supply chain. I'll share an example with you in how we manage a supply chain disruption at the Ministry of Health. We were commissioning a hospital, and that is the Augustus Long Hospital, and we were basically retrofitting an older hospital. We needed to have, we needed to run oxygen lines, and this was at the start of the pandemic in March to May of 2020. Now, COVID is about oxygen supplies. We needed to run oxygen lines, and we needed valves, we needed alarm systems, and several parts. And we had a contractor that was doing the job for us as we would do a subject matter expert. We were competing for parts with possibly every country and every advanced nation that was trying to upscale their COVID management capacity. And at one point, we could not proceed immediately because we did not have some of the parts. We did not have the valves and the alarm parts. And we knew that this actually was disrupting or potentially disrupted our ability to care for patients. Without oxygen in a hospital, we can't use it as a COVID-19 facility, and our numbers were increasing. Now, how did we mitigate the supply chain issues about that? First of all, when we look at the human capital management, we did engage a specialist provider. We did do selective tendering and contract management based on the experience of that supplier, based on their availability and their access to US dollars, which were required. We looked at the level of work that they did regionally and locally and their human resource capacity. We also looked at the relationships that they would have had with suppliers. So that was the first part in it. And we had constant meetings with them and we communicated with them. At one point, it was daily, via WhatsApp calls. We had huddles with them. We had video calls because sometimes it was not feasible for all of us to go down, but we did have walkthroughs, etc. We also looked on their end in terms of increased collaboration, and that's where partnerships and communication comes in, directly speaking to the suppliers and trying to make arrangements. We also looked at the increased use of digital planning tools and really tracking and looking, on a daily basis at where the supplies were coming in, where were the potential issues. Now, in this case, interestingly, we didn't do stress testing and scenario testing, but it was a lesson that we learned as a buffer. We did try and look at local procurement methods, for example, fabrication or using alarms from other sources, but we recognized that it was not the best option, and it would compromise the asset integrity, and it would also compromise the care to patients. So we basically had to use relationships. We had to have that supplier and that contractor. They worked with other islands. They collaborated to get the parts in. The other part as a board that we would look at would be identifying supply chain disruptions through our ERM as an ESG strategy. And really, when the contracts are brought to the board with respect to managing supply chain disruptions, we really need to pay attention to the board notes and look at the contract management. What is the lead time? How long, does it take to have these items in, be it medication, be it parts for medical equipment? So from a board level, in terms of our responsibilities in approving board notes and approving budgets, we need to be very, very cognizant of supply chain disruptions. When we are approving the budgets, we need not just to look at the prior year that we tend to do, but we need to really have that variance in our budget to address increases in freight, to address delays. We need to look at demurrage costs and really have a fair estimation. And as a board, we can't look only at a budget from 2020 or 2021, because those were different years, or 2022, there were restrictions in place. So we need to go back, for example, to say 2018, 2019, and then look at the impact and the variances that would be required. Supply chain disruptions, again, can be identified under the ESG framework and really should be discussed because it is a risk to the sustainability of a company. And again, shock absorbers, again, I make a case for policies and SOPs and scenario planning, business continuity plans, and looking really at contract management. When contracts come to us, we have to ensure that we lock in suppliers at, at a certain price, that we have a contingency planning, that we have a backup supplier, that if we have a plant or we have, for example, critical equipment, that we now put measures in place in our budget and our strategy. We ensure that there's costing for increased parts and increased suppliers. And that is really, if we were stocking, let's say 10 spare parts for an equipment, we now have to consider, do we stock 20? We have to build relationships with suppliers. We saw disruptions in 2020 and 2021, where the technicians and the support personnel could not travel as regularly because of the exemption process, and also because of the negative sort of communication around quarantine processes, because technicians and support personnel from the international companies did not want to come to Trinidad and quarantine for 7 days and then go to the plant to, let's say, to do installations or preventive maintenance and so on. What can help, again, from a board level, would be really ensuring that our policies and our budgets make allowances for digital technologies where equipment can be commissioned, and also where allowances are made, for example, for predictive maintenance, preventive maintenance, and other measures around our equipment. Supply chain disruptions also did occur in the health sector globally, but I'd like to just indicate that the Ministry of Health, in terms of our PPE equipment, in terms of medication, did not have any significant supply chain disruptions. And it really was because of leadership from our principal pharmacist and the fact that she was tracking the usage of items and was able to give to the procurement agency, that is NIBDEC, actual numbers without positive variance. So we never ran out of stock, taking lead time into consideration. And that really underscores the importance of the board and through the relevant committee of having an appropriate demand planning and forecasting measures in place. Again, part of the policies and the operations. Industrial relations. We would have seen the impact of industrial relations in the health sector. We would have seen it in the police service at times. I don't know if you all recall, several years ago, it must have been around 2014 or so, there was a national day when there was basically a national day where the police were doing roadblocks everywhere and there was gridlock traffic. And that would have disrupted our businesses. We must have, as a board, and this is through the HR committee, a clear understanding of how the staff relate and how human relations occur. What are those relationships? Whenever there's a change in policy or we need to shift the policy, we really need as a board to look at that policy and ensure that the media was consulted and that the industrial relations persons and the representatives, the persons on the shop floor, the wardens, have been consulted and have given some sort of agreement or are at an agreement proactively. So that is something that we need to look for through our HR committee. In terms of the key risks and potential opportunities through our HR committees, through our governance committees, and of course our audit committees, we must always consider industrial relations in terms of enterprise risk management and a major factor. And we really need to identify how the organization will function in terms of a business continuity plan. Do we now go on a phased operation if we are in manufacturing or in the energy sector? Is it that we have a plan in place where there's, there are critical parts of the organization, departments that need to go running? Are we going to call out persons when they are on leave or call out persons from another shift? And the HR committee really has to consider the human implications around this. How do people feel in terms of a security situation coming back into the organization if there's a strike that's going on. We need to look at partnerships and ensure that that is highlighted at the board level in terms of the business continuity planning. Do we have a relationship with the local police, the police station that is nearby to us? We need to build relationships, again, with national security, with, in some cases, the army. And these factors need to be built into our policy. Digital technologies is very important in managing industrial relations. We need to ensure through our plans, if we have a work from home policy or a hybrid policy, that our staff is equipped to allow them to have to work from home if required, in the event that they cannot access the organization or the actual physical building, or in the event that we're calling people back from leave. We also need to look at the compensation for persons who do come to leave, who do come to work even if they are on leave, or the persons who we have to leave on extra shifts. And, there needs to be planning as well with how we care about our employees. How do we communicate with them? Are we sending care packages if we have a plan that's running and persons are, no, they can't leave on a 12-hour shift and they have to stay on to a 36-hour shift? We need to really have that sort of leadership and that care and compassion and the people skills really transferred from the board down, because it's all about the culture and a culture of caring and compassion, especially when we're looking at a human situation and what a human resources challenge like industrial relations. The ESG strategy under social really needs to consider the impact of industrial relations and how this can be converted into an opportunity for improved communication, for improved relationships through CSR projects with frontline communities. How do we look at this as sharing information with the public? Communication, as is essential in understanding industrial relations and mitigating it. There needs to be risk communication if industrial relations is being planned. There needs to be a crisis communication plan. There needs to be communication to the media, meetings with the industrial relations persons, and having the experts on the side of the board. And this communication policy with the templates and the SOPs really needs to be established proactively. We can't wait for an incident to occur to now try to write a document and to get information out. We need to have a clear SOP from the board's policy that would have been approved by the board with respect to industrial relations. As I close today, I'd just like to really underscore yet again the importance for culture shifts towards communication and a human-centered approach that really needs to be led by the board. We would have explored about 6 risks and 6 disruptions using real-life examples and examples in Trinidad and Tobago, and how we can mitigate those risks in a disruption to allow business continuity, and also what we did and the lessons learned around them. We need to really embrace change, and change is key when we have to look at the threat and the threat of disruptions, because disruptions are a precursor to change. And we have to remember as a board, when we are approving our policies, when we are speaking to our CEO, who will now have to share the information downwards, or to our CFO, that change sometimes is difficult. Persons resist change because they either don't have clear communication, they don't understand the need for change or the impact for change, or they're just afraid of change. And that's where managing disruption and the need for that human-centered and people-centric approach tied to clear communication comes in. We need to build trust with our employees to ensure successful collaboration and our other stakeholders. And in closing today, I'd just like to ask each of you to really, let's start looking at embracing disruption. Let's look at disruption as an opportunity to innovate, an opportunity to enhance our market competitiveness, and an opportunity to improve the resilience, the sustainability, and strategic agility of our organization. Thank you everyone for your attention, and also for engaging me despite the disruption in terms of our technical difficulties. And I look forward to sharing some questions, perspectives with you and answering your questions.
Thank you so very much, Maryam. Dr. Maryam Abdool-Richards. I expected that this would have been a really, really outstanding presentation, and you did not disappoint. Thank you so much. What I really enjoyed about your presentation is how very well you identified what were different types of disruptions which can occur and how it directly impacts organizations. And that was really well done. For me, what I found was very telling in all of it, even as you gave examples of actual incidents which occurred. I appreciated the fact that so much of what happens, there's not a lot of warning, and how often you mentioned the importance of scenario planning, that we have to consider what are the likely things that can go wrong. And as a result, what then we need to do to be able to prepare the various options of how the organization will move forward. So I know that there may be several persons who would have additional questions. I know that David Clark did put some questions in the chat earlier, some of which I think you did speak to and address in terms of the impact of supply chain disruption and the war in Ukraine and all of that. But if there are additional questions, he can, of course, place it in the chat. I see that we have Saron's hand up at the moment. So I am going to ask Saron to join us and share her question or comment.
Thank you, Kamala. Thank you, Dr. Maryam. I thoroughly enjoyed that presentation. One of the main things I have a comment and a question. From your presentation, I'm learning that a key element in managing disruption is managing risk, is risk management. And I remember working at a company one time, and the audit committee was engaging in risk assessments. And so, but it was done on a departmental level. So each department would identify their risk and come up with ways to mitigate the risk for any challenge. But one of the things I had noticed is that it wasn't necessarily integrated. So the risk management wasn't being handled on an integrated manner. So each department is separately identifying and managing risk. And I remember in some instances, the way one unit would manage a risk could actually be an opportunity for somebody else. Or sometimes the way one unit would manage their risk could create additional risk for somebody else. So could you just comment on maybe the integrated nature of risk? And when the board is looking at risk, it's not just a matter of separate risk management for each unit. It has to be, more integrated on an organizational level. So if you could just comment on that for me, please.
Thank you. That's a very practical question and a real life scenario of what occurs in many organizations where there tends to be a siloed approach. Enterprise risk management is a core function of the audit committee of the board. And in understanding the effectiveness of the audit committee, if there's a quarterly meeting that is being held, or if it's a monthly meeting that's being held, enterprise risk management must feature in that in that meeting. And it's really the role of the audit committee to ask the questions about integrating and to really hold persons accountable with respect to the integration of risk factors. Now, what really helps sometimes is when the information, even in the format of a risk register or a table, is provided from the audit committee or recommended to be inserted into the board pack. So the entire board sees what's going on, and then they would note commonalities that are in place. And it's really the CEO's job now to act on that strategy. And we have to hold the CEO in that case responsible, because the CEO now has to communicate. Now, if we want to look at integration of risk management, communication again is very key. And I can't underscore the importance of communication and the importance of people skills. You need to walk your floor. You need to have your CEO and the relevant heads walk the floor, management by walking around. And that trust and drive has to come from the board of directors. You won't know the risk and you won't understand the real risks unless you walk your plant or unless you walk your hospital. And when the board encourages that approach, and in some cases, boards walk, they might do a visit once a year. You know, you don't want to be too operational. You have that risk on the board side. But when you walk the floor and people, the staff sees you, they build trust because there's a level of, hey, you know, the CEO is working, my managers are working, and they're listening to me. So integration of risk management is a clear question that the board and the audit committee has to review, starting with the audit committee. The CEO should be held responsible, and management by walking around and communication is key. And if it's not ongoing, or there's no success, it has to be followed up. You know, you need to ask every month or every quarter, well, what have you done? What is your success in this matter? What support do you need from the board? Is it that you need you know, like the board to work, or is it that you need external support or somebody outsourced? Do you need subject matter expertise? Do you need to bring in you know, like an advisory firm, the PwCs, the EYs, the KPMGs, the Deloittes? But really and truly, that's what we need to. But I would start with communication and working.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Maryam. In fact, I have a follow-up question to that because yes, it's very important for the CEO and top management to be visible and to understand all that's happening within the operations of the organization. But from time to time, you may find that the board is a little bit remote. And I found that during your presentation, you spoke throughout about the importance of the board being so aware and being prepared for any eventuality. So they need to know what the strengths of the organizations are. So would you recommend that the board ensure, how do they ensure that they know so well? Should they too walk the floor, or should it just be the audit committee members? So what would you recommend?
Well, that is a very interesting question yet again, because there's always the risk that a board becomes too operational, especially in organizations. Of course, the role of the CEO and the executive management would be to present a strategy and for the board to interrogate and approve that strategy and the appropriate budget. So we always have to consider a board and the risk of being too operational. Now, what I would suggest in an instance like this, and it really goes towards the board evaluations, would be regular, let's say a board evaluation on twice a year. I know that Ron, if he's on this call, will be a big proponent of this measure. But through board evaluations that are done with a facilitator, with an independent person, the executive management can now share where the issues are. And it's also advocated in some settings that possibly on twice a year or every quarter, board members walk the relevant organization. You know, they attend the social settings, so there are faces behind these persons. Now, it does not mean that you're going into the organization, into a department and giving directives, but there must be a level of trust and a humane side and a care side. And it just needs to be really, I would say it should be bespoke to the organization that you're working in and the risk that you're working in. Now, I'd just like to touch on another part, which is when does a board become operational? And I recall this discussion with Alison and asking her when we were doing the certificate. If there is a major risk or a major threat to the organization that can affect its sustainability or its operation, then the board can go in and can support the CEO. Or if there's no CEO, I don't know if you have a disaster, a major disaster, and somebody can't access the plant, or they would have had some adverse event, you know, illness or otherwise, then in that case, the board can become directly involved. So, you know, your question really about walking the floor is one that, yes, should occur, but it should be done in conjunction with discussion with the executive management to mitigate the risk of the executive management believing that the board is now becoming overly operational.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent, Maryam, because in fact, that's a very important distinction. What is governance from what is management?
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, even if directors walk the floor, they're not there as management, and they need to understand and separate what exactly is governance and their role in oversight, which requires them to understand, as opposed to yes, as opposed to becoming involved to give instructions. We have a question in the chat, which I want to go to, and then I will come to Jules. I see his hand up. So Dr. Jules, 1 minute, right? We have a question from Yakima Kafi. Yakima, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Her question is, would disruption caused as a result of a merger or acquisition be considered a wicked problem?
Thanks for that question. I mean, when I was doing this session and I was looking at the causes of disruption, I was like, okay, there are three categories really that we could broadly speak of that cause disruption. Now, a wicked problem is really one that is difficult and really impossible to really define, because there's just changing information. There's no definitive formula. There's no real test. There's no real solution. As I said, climate change is one, crime would be one. I would say no, because if a merger or an acquisition or a partnership is done, then there should have been proper planning. Again, whenever a merger and acquisition or strategic collaboration is being done or a partnership, I learned this from Jules some years ago. I won't disclose how many years, but I learned and did this with Jules. The first part is really looking at the cross-cultural adaptability between the two organizations and the communication. You can't just go, and people are afraid when there's a merger and acquisition. The first thing people are afraid of is that they would lose their jobs and they lose their income, so they feel unsafe. So it's not really a wicked problem, because it can be resolved, and it can be resolved by communication and collaboration at the start of the process, understanding the cultural nuances, sharing information that may not be proprietary, and really even understanding, like, for example, the CBTT, and sharing information about the CBTT regulations, putting all the relevant media ads, on the media if there's an acquisition in place. And that information should not come from a journalist calling in. That information should come from the companies, and there also should be some sort of relationship with the trade unions if you're industrialized, to let people know what the potential plans are. So I won't consider it a wicked problem, because there is a solution and we don't have to reinvent the wheel around it. And the solutions lie around cultural adaptability, communication, compliance with the relevant legislation and regulations, CBTT, if you're in the financial services, for example, TTSE, etc.
Excellent. And I would also want to add that usually mergers and acquisitions lead to expansion of a company. There's usually opportunities and benefits. So if we focus on those areas as well, then those fears, may be mitigated. So sorry, go ahead, Maryam, before I invite
I wanted to say that I really liked that question, because it really demonstrated, and thank you very much, Ms. Coffey, it really allowed us to understand the different types of problems. So thank you, that was an excellent question, because I think now everybody would have an understanding of really where a wicked problem would be. And thank you, Kamala, for really looking at the wicked problem or the challenge in the acquisition in terms of opportunity building.
Yes, thank you. All right, Jules, I've added you to the panel. Feel free to unmute and let's hear your question or comment, or both.
Well, comment. Excellent presentation. I mean, it has been an honor for me to sit at your feet and learn from you as you expanded on some very important aspects of management and leadership. Earlier in your presentation, you talked about the challenges with mindset, and a little later on, you made a comment about innovation. I think it may be true to say, even without the data, it may be true to say that we in the Caribbean region still have a little bit that we need to be doing in terms of moving in the direction of innovation. But that too is a mindset thing.
That is a mindset and a cultural
That's
factor.
Right. So my question now is, how do we as board members and members of the C-suite of our enterprises influence that mindset throughout the organization? How do we go about doing it? And even as you get ready to answer that, you may not have seen yet my comment in the chat. I think you have a serious responsibility to disseminate a lot of this information throughout Trinidad and Tobago and beyond, the leaders and the leadership in the region need to be exposed to the content that you have shared with us this afternoon. So I just throw that out there.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to let everyone know, I always keep saying this, that Dr. Ferdinand Jules was actually one of my lecturers for a couple of courses at two courses at LogJack, and also my practicum supervisor. And you know, it's really an honor when you meet a teacher and you continue this relationship with them. So thank you very much. So your question, Jules, was really about how does the board and the C-suite promote innovation and a culture of innovation? As I saw that question, I'd just like to reiterate that we may think of ourselves as non-executive directors, but we have to remember two persons who are on the board as well with us, who tend to be on the board. And we have to really look at what they are doing and their role, which may be a bit different from the directors. And that is the CEO or MD and the CFO. And they must be integrated in the plan. They must have the same intentions. There should not be disparity or misalignment in their strategy or what they believe is the strategy and what the board wants. That disconnect creates a huge problem. To infuse a culture of innovation will require the board leading. And the board infuses that culture of innovation by communicating with your CEO and CFO, because CFO holds budget, the benefits of innovation. Innovation training should also form part of the talent management policies of the board. And there should be a budget that is assigned to talent management training around innovation. Also, in terms of your human resource policies, there should be allowances and arrangements in place for study visits and exchange of informations, non-proprietary stuff within the organization with other organizations. And I'll give an example about, I'll give you all a real life example. At one of the organizations that I am a director on, we want to look at innovative practices around renewable energy. We've identified renewable energy as a strategic priority, not just in ESG, but we've used the issues around energy production and energy use as an opportunity now to innovate. And one of the measures that we took as a board was to really promote relationship building with the relevant chambers through our CEO. And another one was to build relationships chairman to chairman with other organizations in the energy sector, with 3 or 4, where they have innovative techniques. So we do exchanges, we do technical cooperation, and we do training. And the board needs to lead that approach, and the board needs to support the CEO. And if the CEO is misaligned or doesn't have a clear understanding, we need to listen to that CEO and to understand, because he may or she may be walking the floor and understand where the resistance is. But it's all about a culture change and a culture shift and a mindset shift, and understanding what may be the deterrents to this change and working on it, and the board taking leadership in establishing the relevant relationships and ensuring that the budgetary allocations are in place to support such activities.
Very good. Thank you so much, Maryam. So are there any other persons who wish to ask any questions? I see we've had quite a few comments in the chat, Maryam, saying that it was an excellent presentation today. So I'm very happy for that.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for listening. There's always a case of nerves before these presentations. I mean, we're all human, we all experience it. But I really want to thank and recognize the CCGI, with whom I built an excellent relationship, not just personally, but through organizations. I have developed a lot of networks and collaborative relationships with persons in Trinidad and Tobago, in the governance sphere, as well as regionally, and colleagues, across the energy sector, the financial services sector, the NGO sector, that we can work and exchange ideas on. And as I leave, I'd just like to mention and recognize some persons who would have supported me in, bouncing ideas off in terms of the presentation. One of those would be Anthony Zamora, who is out of PwC and a cybersecurity expert. And, he was very helpful in, discussing and providing guidance. I just want to recognize, of course, Dr. Ferdinand for his teachings, not just at Lockjack, but in the master's certificate course. And I would just like to refer to documents that and articles that I would have obtained to support the information. I use information from EY, from Deloitte, from PwC, the Wall Street Journal, and the Economist, because I had to look at, articles regarding geopolitical situations. And of course, I always give kudos to the entire energy sector. The energy sector has been a model, and I would say an international real life they are exemplars in terms of preventing disruption. I think there are two sectors, and most of the energy sector, because they had the actual disruptions, that managed it effectively. And that is the energy sector across all companies and the financial services sector. We never had, a shutdown or anything like that. So thank you very much, everyone. And I hope you have a very pleasant evening and that 2023 treats you very well.